My name is Michael Gayed, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. Joining me for the hour is Mr. Steve Ward, who was a reference from Mandy's Rafsanjani, who I had on a Twitter space not too long ago. Spent the last hour reviewing some of his prior podcasts. I think this will be really quite interesting and useful, especially given the volatility that we're seeing more recently here. Steve, introduce yourself to the audience. Who are you? What's your background? And how did you get involved in the trading and coaching side of the business?
Yeah, hi, Michael, and hi, everybody. So my name is Steve Ward. I'm a trader, performance coach / consultant. Work with traders and PMs and analysts at hedge funds, banks, commodities trading houses, energy firms, prop trading groups, really across the whole spectrum of the markets. Newer traders right through to people who've been in the markets 25, 30 years plus. My sort of specialities are, I guess I would summarize it as looking at the role that the mind and the body, so the psychology and the physiology of risk-taking and decision-making and high performance for my clients. I've been doing that since very early 2005. Prior to that, worked as a sports psychology coach to elite athletes and teams in about 33 sports all over the globe. And along the way, I've also had a little dabble in working with professional poker players on the European Pro Tour.
Talk about that transition. First of all, why did you pivot to the financial market side from the sports side?
Yeah, it was purely luck. There was no career crafting or cultivating. It was purely an opportunity that arose, a chance encounter on a sports psychology program that I was running that was attended by someone who was an ex-professional tennis player, but was currently in post as the head of performance and learning for a very large proprietary trading group. And he'd basically identified that they were doing a lot of really good things around facilitating high performance for their traders, but they were doing nothing really around what he kind of termed at the time sort of just mindset. And he'd obviously come from a pro sports background, was very aware of the importance of mindset and wanted to create a program, coaching, training to help the traders there to essentially to improve their performance. So it purely by randomness. And then that was, say, February 2005. It ended up being quite a hefty piece of work in the end. And then really word of mouth, just my own interest led to me really pivoting probably after the Winter Olympics in 2006. I probably made that move, into sort of markets full time.
So when I hear sports psychology, my mind goes to the psychology of winning, psychology of losing, overconfidence, having to regain your confidence. Is that an overly simplistic way of thinking about that side of coaching and helping others that are, high performing athletes?
Well, I think there's certainly themes that are important. If I look at my work, I guess what I'm trying to do probably in big chunks is as a part of my work, which is helping the trader, the PM, the analyst to kind of develop self-awareness, to understand themselves as a trader, as a PM, as an analyst, understand strengths, weaknesses, values, goals, motivations, what confidence is for them, what motivation is for them, what high performance means for them, helping them to bring all of that and align it to a trading or investing approach, and matching those two up. So kind of, let's call that sort of a self-awareness piece. I think there's a large piece of my work which is then around self-improvement, so putting in processes for goal setting, developing skill, evaluating, reflecting, gaining insights. Let's call that sort of a self-improvement piece. And then there's probably a piece, and we'll maybe call this self-regulation to keep it sort of self-focused, which is around having the skills and abilities, as you said, to navigate the highs and lows of the trading and investing experience. So to be able to manage the thoughts, the emotions, the sensations in the body, the urges and the impulses that show up at various times as the trader or the PM goes about executing their craft.
So the motivation part, I think, is interesting maybe to tease out a little bit, only because I would think simplistically, a lot of people would say the motivation for every trader and PM is just to make more money. But you and I both know that's not really the full story as to why people get into this business of investing. So when you deal with different clients of yours, what are sort of the range of motivations in terms of that self-awareness for why people enter the business and love the business?
Yeah, I mean, and the key words in your question are the range. So I think it's important to recognize that there is a range. And I mean, for some people, they are primarily monetary driven. That is the main overt motivation. For many people, I think getting into the industry, that might be, again, a prime motivator. As people get into the industry and transition through it, I think sometimes people's motivations change. So that's important to recognize as well. Some people enjoy the challenge. A client that comes to mind who is a phenomenal trader, very much sees trading as a puzzle. He's a real, competent puzzle solver in general, sees the market, sees trading as a really complex puzzle, and he enjoys it from that perspective. I've had other people that have come into it from backgammon or from chess or from poker that maybe see it as like a game of risk reward, which again, they very much enjoy. I guess maybe a slightly deeper, more esoterical level. I've got people that I coach that talk a lot about how the experience of trading and investing really allows them to test themselves, to uncover parts of themselves. Maybe I think, trading and investing can be quite revealing about our character. And there's a sense of, becoming a better person through the process of trying to become a better trader or a better investor. So that there's maybe that element for some people as well. For some people, there might be things to prove, to themselves and or to others, and trading or investing is a vehicle for that. So I think there's a whole range of motivations. I think they can be transitional. For some people, probably, and this is important for sustainability, the ones that are maybe more intrinsically focused probably have greater longevity, a bit more robust and stable. The ones that are more extrinsic, money, compensation, bonuses, they might be a driver, they might be important to some degree, but obviously the external motivations, perhaps for longevity, maybe not quite as effective. And, again, obviously, in the coaching process, even if people said it's about the money or it's about the compensation, I'd be curious about, what the money or the compensation actually allows them. So, what is it that, making that amount of money actually gives you other than the money itself? Quite often things like freedom comes up, autonomy, security, some of these more sort of intrinsic values-based type motivators.
How does one's upbringing factor into the psychology of trading? And now, just for some color on that, I grew up seeing my father, love the investment business, working at Merrill Lynch and starting his own investment advisory firm, having his own hedge fund. His style was very different than mine. And part of that is just a different temperament and way of thinking about how to deal with uncertainty. But I think it's also sort of, for me personally, it's my way of differentiating myself, even though it's obviously the same blood, right? They're run between us, right? So how does upbringing factor into motivation and process, whether it's somebody that's actually grew up in the business or somebody that's new to it?
Well, if we look at who we are today, for yourself, for myself, and for everyone who's listening, we are predominantly the result of three forces. One of those will be disposition. So let's just call that personality to keep it simple. The other two forces are environment and then experience. So essentially what we would call our learning history, our upbringing, to keep it simple. So as we navigate through life, we are both consciously and unconsciously learning things about ourselves, about the world, about other people. We learn those lessons from our parents, from school, from universities, from sports clubs, music, wherever it might be. So, we're being shaped constantly. And again, likewise, we're being shaped in our early careers in the markets as well. So there's a lot of shaping going on. And obviously that will then play out in the markets, because obviously we will form, for example, if we just look at risk alone, people will have different preferences for risk. So how somebody perceives risk, even what a risk is. Thinking about volatility. For some people, volatility might be perceived as a risk, a negative risk, for example. Somebody else might perceive volatility as an opportunity. So risk perception can be partly dispositional, but also partly it will be down to the environments we grew up in. Then it will affect how we might manage our risks. So, what we trade, how we trade it, whether we might be, making big outright directional bets, or maybe we're, trading pairs or relative value to try and manage that risk in a different way. And the markets we trade, the volatility, liquidity that's in those markets that we trade, and our choices will probably be a factor. And then how we respond to and manage the consequences of the risk we've got. So how we deal with losses, again, is going to be a function of our disposition, but also, what we've learned about mistakes and so on. So for example, I kind of can summarize this in a very good client example, a recent one. I'm doing some work with a trader at the moment. And with that trader, we're looking at ways of being more effective at dealing with losses and navigating drawdown. And in a conversation recently, a few things came out, which I think are interesting to share. One is the fact that when he has a big loss or when he's going through a more severe drawdown, some of the feelings that he experiences include things like shame and guilt. And there can be a sense of embarrassment linked to the fact that in his mind, he's made a mistake, and probably with his level of skill, he shouldn't be making those mistakes. So we've got to have a process for navigating that. And now not all traders will have exactly the same response to a loss, but that's how he experiences it. Other people, it may be different. But the reason why I want to share this particular example is because, and it was interesting for me, is when he was growing up, the school system that he grew up in his words, is one which only really focuses on the result. So all they really care about in the school system, and this was reflected in his household, was the result you get. And there wasn't really any balancing between the result and, for example, the effort that you put in or the way you went about approaching the problem that you were trying to solve. So you either you got it right or you didn't, you did well or you didn't, you're kind of a high achiever or you're not a high achiever. And all of that learning history is playing out in how he approaches the markets. And it's also reflecting on the emotions he experiences when he has to deal with the consequences of taking a loss and so on. So learning history definitely is going to play out. The beauty of learning history, of course, is that it's continually in process. So, tomorrow, a part of today will be the latest chapter in our learning history. And so we can't change our disposition, but of course we can influence environment and experiences, i.e. learning. And so we can be thinking about, who we might want to become in the future and looking to shape that as we move forward as well. So almost like, thinking about our future learning history can be useful. And I guess I've had the luxury of being at the elite sports end and at the elite trading and investing end. And people often ask me, what is similar between the two? Well, I'll often take the counter view and go, well, what's different? And the difference is obviously in sport, in most sports, even something like cycling where you compete a lot, you also have a lot of time when you're not competing. There are also dedicated training periods, and there are identifiable skills, and there are then processes put in place to train and develop those skills. So one of the questions that's interesting, I think, for traders and for investors to be thinking about is, what is trading skill? What is investing skill? Because once we start to think about them as skill-based activities, then essentially we can start to look at, what are the component pieces? What are the component skills that make up successful trading or investing? And then we can get to the question of, and now how do we train them? The challenge is always going to be, certainly from my side, if I think about it just in terms of the mental skills, when I was working in elite sport, we would often train mental skills off season and then work to implement and refine during the in season. Of course, for my trading and investing clients, we don't have luxury of off season. So any training we're doing in season. And what it means particularly is we probably have to just bear in mind that in terms of bandwidth, there's less time, energy and effort available to do, let's call it the skill development once we're kind of in the process of performing. But we can still do some. So for example, I think, an obvious skill can be like, knowledge acquisition. So learning, training, coaching can be a skill acquisition, both mental, emotional, physical, technical, and tactical. So they're always available for people. Then I think, a very powerful piece of skill development, and this is true now in the sports world, is performance analysis and then reflection on the data that you collect, looking for insights and feeding that forward into action. Things like preparation and planning can be combined with mental simulation of what market scenarios might play out, how you might respond. If you've made good decisions during the course of a day, you could review and replay those mentally or via screen recording at the end of the day. So I think that there are a number of practices that are available to traders and PMs to put in place. And then it's really just trying to work out, the dosage, how am I going to fit that into my week or over the course of the month? How might I plan that? Recognizing the fact that unlike for an athlete, we're probably not going to get, days at a time where we can just go into training mode. We're not maybe going to get hours a day when we can do that. But, can we find slots per day, slots per week to work on some of the mental, the emotional, the physical, the technical, the tactical, and maybe the knowledge-based skills that we want to work on.
But I think that there's a key difference there also, right? Which is that, okay, so you train, you physically are getting stronger, you're getting faster, you're getting more aware of different scenarios. There's an actual impact on the likelihood of you performing better with every single rep of some dumbbell, right? But when it comes to this domain of investing, it's not as clear the link between the results and learning more about markets, right? Because there's always a degree of randomness and luck and error and small sample bias, whereas there's a tighter link between effort and result in most other domains, I'd argue.
Yeah, no, I would agree. In the short term, particularly, what I do today to improve my trading skill and what I do tomorrow may not show up the next day, the next week, maybe even the next month, maybe even this year. And that is always the challenge. If I'm playing the violin, I think, music is a very good one as a counter argument. If I want to get good at the violin, there's a very strong correlation between how much practice I do and the quality of that practice, and then the quality of my performance. In trading and investing, unfortunately, that correlation obviously is less strong. And this is often the challenge in people finding the motivation maybe to do that work. Obviously, it's easier for all of us if we do something now and see a return straight away. But allocating time and effort to a skill practice, knowledge gaining, whatever it might be in trading and investing, without knowing we're going to get an immediate return or what that return might even look like, is of course difficult. Yet I think we've got sufficient observational data to see that the people that are doing that type of work ongoing are increasing their own chances of success. But you're right, we may not have the tangibility always to reinforce that, again, particularly in the short term.
Yeah, and that obviously relates to uncertainty and how people respond to uncertainty. It's not just uncertainty in markets, it's uncertainty in whether in the small sample your skill set in analyzing markets is going to matter, right? It might overrule the die, but we all know that anything can happen in the very short term and cause drawdowns and impact one's psychology. Now, I want to go back a little bit to the point you mentioned about self-awareness. It's hard enough to know somebody, let alone somebody knowing themselves, right? And it's to me, this is always kind of the challenge, I would think, with a psychiatrist. It's almost like garbage in, garbage out. You've got to get information from the client, but you don't know if the client's even assessing the kind of baseline data of who they are in the right way to then come up with a conclusion. So talk about, for the audience, how you go about that process of not only learning the psychological makeup of a trader, but even knowing if what the trader is telling you is accurate in terms of the way they themselves are trying to frame themselves.
Yeah. This is, as you say, this is the challenge of self-awareness is as a coach, you are ideally hoping they've already got sufficient high levels of self-awareness in your clients when they come to you, so that what you're getting from them has some kind of validity. So, and there's a little bit of a leap of faith in that initially. I think once you work with a person for a few sessions, you get a good idea about it. But what I do personally, where I can, is I will also speak with the client. Got quite a relatively well-formed set of questions. So we do what we call a biographical inquiry, quite in depth. Hear it from their words. That is very, very important. And then what I like to do is I will probably speak with, if they're on a trading desk, they'll have a head of desk. So I'll try and get some input from the head of desk, maybe from a peer, so a colleague, someone they're working with, and then perhaps somebody from kind of the firm's management, maybe from in risk, maybe from in HR or talent. So I'll try and get 3 or 4 different perspectives as well. So I'll do interview the trader, interview people around the trader, above, below, sideways, and so on. If they've got a junior that they work with, I'll probably interview the junior as well. And that gives me some different perspectives on how other people see them. And then we might see some similarities and we might see some differences. Not that either is better or worse. They're all just perceptions. Ultimately, I can form my own judgment based on my experience, but again, it's a perception. And then what I will try and get, if it's available, is to get some trading data, because trading data, decision-making data, will reveal patterns in people's behavior, which again may be supported by their own level of self-awareness and or not, and likewise those of others. But if we get those three areas covered, if we can tick off self-awareness from the person, external perspective from those who know them well, and if we can get some actual objective trading data as well, put all of that together, and then we probably start to get a relatively rounded and hopefully accurate picture of the person.
I'm going to make the assumption that the data, which is probably most telling, is data around what actions are being taken in different volatility regimes, right? Which will relate to drawdowns and the uncertainty that wildly gyrating prices can have on not just a portfolio, but one's sort of mental state and mental health. Are there any common threads that you've seen in terms of how the very good traders respond to volatility versus the very bad traders? I have to assume that ultimately that's probably the thing that differentiates people the most.
Well, I think the two most important words, and probably also the least helpful words in my sort of branch of psychology, are "it depends." So, different traders will respond to volatility differently, and it's not always better and or worse. What's important to understand when I'm working with clients is I'm trying to help people to understand themselves and to understand, what volatility means for them, how they might respond to it, what's their perception of volatility. Is higher volatility for them do they see that as being useful, less useful, somewhere in between? How does that relate to their general trading style and approach? What does it mean in the context they're actually operating within? So there's a number of factors to understand. And then based on all of that, then the person hopefully, and I've had a conversation with a client prior to our call today, where we're discussing obviously what's been going on recently. And again, what I'm trying to do is help them to understand, what is the context in the markets right now as it relates to you, what you're trying to achieve, your risk personality, your risk profile, the firm that you're operating in, and what you want to achieve in this case by the end of the quarter, and therefore also towards the end of the year. So you've got to kind of look at the context, and then we can start to think about, what is the useful thing or not to do. And the answer is it will vary from person to person. But I think if we look at it, if we go if we push to one side, the psychology, and go a level deeper and look at it biologically, what we know in general is that volatility is a stress response stimulator. So in most people, when we get increasing volatility, we tend to get within the central nervous system an increasing of response, and therefore the stress levels go up. And again, for some people, that can be very much a positive. For other people, that can become maybe not so helpful. But so biologically, we can understand that if we think about stress as being cumulative, it can come from many different areas. If there's increasing volatility, then our kind of capacity for stress, our threshold, is kind of some of that is being taken up by the increased volatility. So we need to bear in mind that there may be an impact for some people just at the biological level in their ability to function well if the volatility becomes so great that actually for them it becomes very stressful in this terms as a negative stressor. I've got other people I know who literally pray all year round for volatility in the markets to be high, because that's where they function at their best, either by disposition or by skill and training. So one person's volatility is a stressor, for somebody else it's an opportunity. So it depends. Is the coaching answer.
I had put out a tweet saying the good thing about this market is that the stress will kill you before the bank runs do. I think it's accurate. But this point about the stress management at this point, I think is important, right? Because there's this other underappreciated aspect, I think, by newbie traders, which is that this has a real physical toll. It's not just mental. I mean, the mental part of it is challenging in and of itself. But the fact that, there's a release of cortisol, right, from every sort of stressful situation, it makes people, honestly, it kind of screws up their sense of rewarding just mentally, right? I mean, you get kind of numb to other life's joys when you're constantly worried about losses and you're seeing it day to day as long as the market's open. So part of this, I have to assume, is also for you is trying to right somebody's mentality, not just around markets, but how to view life in a more positive way, especially when you're in these kind of stressful market dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, we can't ignore the fact the mind and the body are connected. So my work is really what we would call kind of psychophysiological. So it's a very much a mind and body approach. The mind impacts the body impacts the mind. The brain itself, 2% of our body weight, 20 to 25% of our calorific consumption. It's embodied, sits inside the body. So our risk taking, our decision making is influenced by the physical state of the body. We know that people that are fatigued become more risk averse over time. Stress response really is interesting because there's two time frames to consider for stress. One is what we call an acute stress response, i.e. a kind of an in the moment short-term stress response, which actually the body, brain, mind system is well adapted for. As humans, we're good at that. And we might need that on high volatility, demanding trading days. I had a few clients on Monday that contacted me at the end of the day, very demanding days. High adrenaline, lots of ups and downs. Thankfully, most of them did very well, but very draining. And that's the stress response system, kind of activating, energizing, focusing, helping people to perform at their best in a very kind of a challenging situation. If on the flip side, someone in drawdown, which is also stressful, but as it drags on over time, we shift from this kind of acute performance enhancing stress response into something that's called chronic stress. And this is this kind of ongoing, slower moving feeling. And you're right, cortisol builds up in the body. Great work from John Coates, who wrote the book, The Hour Between Dog and Wolf, showing, as that chronic stress increases, cortisol in traders increases. And again, the output of that in terms of trading behavior is typically a bias towards risk aversion. So it really plays out. But of course, what cortisol also does, it's a stress hormone and it impacts our health and well-being. Again, if we're having excessive cortisol over time, it's catabolic. It breaks the body down. It might start with, we get a bit of a sniff, a cold, can turn into a virus, can become worse than that over time. So, there is a health and well-being impact as we're exposed to the stresses of trading, which is why, psychologically, but also physiologically, part of my role is helping my clients to develop mechanisms that make them more robust to the forces of stress, and that we also importantly see things like well-being, which can be seen by some people as a bit of a softer skill, as it used to be in sport and indeed in the military, which is now really becoming more central and actually probably inextricably linked to being able to sustain high performance in the markets over time. So, we're definitely shifting. So, yeah, I think for traders, it's important to think about process, how I do what I do, my market approach, preparation, execution, evaluation, all of that piece. And then to think about, sort of two other areas to do some work on and be thinking about, which are the psychological, the mind piece, but also that physiology and the body piece. And then to kind of build habits, routines, practices, which link those three things together, but to see the mind and body not as two separate entities really, but as a part of the trading process, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I just think it's and this better than a lot of people seeing a lot of different clients in this, but it's easier said than done, right? So there's a lot of studies that show that, discipline, for example, is like a muscle, right? It exhausts. And the more decisions you have to make in a day, and when you're a trader and looking at markets, you could be making a whole lot of decisions. It makes it harder to be disciplined, right? And, which means people end up going to comfort food and doing things which are not healthy. God knows I do it myself, right? So I think you use the word correctly, right? The key thing is to develop the right habits. but presumably it's a lot easier to build the right habits when you don't already have the cortisol built up in the system.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the challenge of, once we start to get high levels of stress and or high levels of fatigue, and high stress often leads to high fatigue, because when we're stressed, obviously, the nervous system is running at a higher level of gas. So we're burning more fuel per minute as such. So we start to fatigue more quickly. When we're stressed and fatigued, we're really just trying to, survive the day, trying to sort of just get through. There's not the resources, there's no bandwidth left to really start thinking about, building new behaviors, building new habits. It's why it's very hard to make change. I find this with my trading clients. If they're having a really tough time, maybe the markets have changed, they need to adapt their trading style or approach. If they've been through a period of drawdown or struggle, the paradox or the challenge is the fact that they're already fatigued and stressed. And it's really hard then to kind of, find where we're going to get the resources, because change requires you to build new behaviors. It's an active, energizing process. But if you're fatigued and stressed, you don't have the bandwidth or the capacity to do that process with. So it can be difficult. So ideally, of course, what we would want, and again, this is where sport and trading are very different, is we try and find periods where we can build the habits so we've got them for when we need them. And this is why, often in my work, what I find with clients is if I do sessions for grads or for newer traders, they don't always really appreciate the real demands of trading and investing in the markets in terms of how it's actually going to feel when you lose money, real money, big sums of money, when you go through a tough drawdown. And so it's quite hard for them sometimes to invest in the time and effort to almost front load and learn the skills up front. So they don't really realize that they're going to need them until they actually need them. So, but I think where possible, it is important that this is part of my, approach is we recognize in advance what the challenges are, what they might be. And as much as we can, we build a front end, which has a robust process, has good psychological habits and skills training, has good process around physiology, things like sleep, exercise, nutrition, recovery, could include breath work practice and so on. And we try and build it. I always think about like a funnel, Michael. So you kind of have a funnel where at the front end, it's kind of, we want to have a wide entry to the funnel, lots of good practices, and then sort of the two lines that are converging down to kind of what's left over, which is the trading experience. And if we can do enough work at the front end, we can't eradicate the challenges of the trading experience, but we can certainly reduce it, and then we just manage what's left over. But if we don't build the good practices, build the process, develop the psychology, work on the physiology at the front end, then we're going to have more to manage at the back end. That's the payoff. So, and the reality is probably it's work that's being done continuously throughout a trader's career over time as they gain experience, gain awareness, go through more challenges and so on.
Have you seen any interesting research or trends around how short-termism and attention spans are making it harder to be a good trader? I mean, I've referenced that before, but there was a Microsoft study done in the late 90s. Somehow, however they tested attention spans, they found that the average attention span was like 12 seconds back then. And then they reran the study like a decade ago, and it went from 12 seconds to 9 seconds, which means most people on this Twitter space don't even remember my name. Right. Conversation. But my point is that, we're in an environment where increasingly there's just shorter and shorter attention spans. And I have to imagine that makes the psychological management part of this business harder, because the shorter your time frame, the more likely you are getting not only whipsawed, but responding off of noise that may not mean anything to long-term results.
Yeah. It's funny because I literally just did a session last week for a hedge fund client around the topic of attention and focus. So it's fresh in my mind. So there's a great quote, a guy called B. Alan Wallace. I think his book's called The Attention Revolution. And in there somewhere is a quote which is somewhere along the lines of, without good attention, you can't do anything well. And coming from sport many years ago, attention, concentration, focus, and they're three different things, by the way. They're not the same thing. So attention is sort of like the resource. Focus is the ability to kind of direct that attention to where you want it to be. And then concentration is how long you can sustain the focus where you want it to be. So they are three integrated but different elements. But you're right. I mean, whether we're reading, researching, watching the market, making a decision at any given moment, what our performance is going to be influenced by the quality of our attention / focus / concentration. So it does have a payoff. I think it affects different people in different ways, depending upon your trading time frame, your style, and so on. So it will kind of impact you differently. But I've heard from a number of clients, and I probably started hearing this, I would say 2010 onwards. I had an increasing number of clients telling me that they had noticed, or their partners had noticed, or people that know them well had noticed that their attention spans were getting increasingly shorter. So but again, a friend of mine who's a neuroscientist, they call this the poverty of attention, which is kind of we are experiencing as a result of what is essentially a competition for our attention, both external devices, technology, and so on, but also internal, our own mind. So yes, it's a challenge. It definitely has an impact. The good news is that attention is a trainable resource. Focus can be trained and concentration can be trained. So for some of my clients, if we identify again that for them attention is a challenge, then there are practices that they can do should they again be willing to invest the time and effort to improve that attention, and also as a result awareness, interestingly, which is important in their trading and investing. So yeah, but again, this is it's like sleep. Many years ago, people, they worked, they got tired, they went to bed and they slept. Now we need to read there are books about how to sleep. There are courses you can go on about learn how to sleep well. It's a natural function. Attention and focus, really, these are core human functions. And now we're having to think about training it and developing it and managing it and reading it, going on a course to improve it. Again, as a nature, as a consequence, obviously, is how the world's evolved around us.
Let's talk about behavioral biases that you see most often or most common. So I think like you, a big fan of behavioral finance, not just sort of the classic studies by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, but like James Montier, right, was a phenomenal thinker when it came to behavioral investing and psychology and trading. Yeah. Are there certain biases that you see that are becoming more prevalent, certain heuristics, like the availability heuristic, confirmation bias, recency bias? I myself get the sense that, which kind of relates to the short-termism and attention spans, recency bias is at an all-time high. Everyone's just extrapolating out the very short term to the tomorrow. Any kind of interesting observations there with your clients?
Yeah, well, I would agree. Recency, I think, is a strong one that plays out. Interestingly, even my 13-year-old son had a conversation with me recently about his observation of recency bias in people. I hadn't taught him that, by the way. He'd obviously just picked it up somewhere. So if 13-year-olds are talking to me about recency bias, then it's probably happening out there. So that's interesting. Yeah, I think loss aversion, again, I think, much as it's a common one, I think it's a key one because, if you look at the stats and the data and we see it in the data from my clients, taking losses is still the fact that's difficult for a lot of people. So I say loss aversion in that one at the top end, overconfidence / complacency that comes when you're on a winning run. I've seen a few traders at the back end of last year had really good years, but towards the end of the year with big P&Ls behind them, got prone to overconfidence, bit of complacency. So I think, at the other end of the spectrum, they're equally as damaging. I mean, when I started working trading, 2005, February, I think there were probably, I'm going to have a stab at, let's say, 10 to 15 identifiable kind of, in the common language type biases. I remember reading an article a few years back where they said that at that point there was 108 now kind of recognized biases. So I think the challenge with behavioral biases is twofold. One is there's so many of them. Like at any given point in time, if I don't get out of a trade, is that because I had loss aversion, or is it the endowment effect and I'm stuck in the trade because I'm in the position, I've been in it for a while? Is it sunk cost because I put a lot of time and effort into researching the trade and I don't want to kind of now get out of it because I've invested all the time and effort? Is it a combination of all three? Is it a fact that actually I lost money on the last trade, so I'm just more sensitive to losing on this particular trade? It's quite hard sometimes to really distinguish as to what bias is playing out in real time. It's quite hard to spot them in ourselves, which is also a challenge. So I have an interest in behavioral bias, but I have a challenge with it in terms of I think it's really useful looking at market behavior, but for individuals, it's challenging. But where I do use it is I have a process that we call behavioral risk management. And what that basically is, it sounds probably a bit sexier than it really is. But what it is essentially about is, as a trader or a PM, it's about understanding when are the conditions and what are the reasons why you might make a suboptimal decision. And that might be because we realize that actually you have problems taking losses. And let's just keep it simple. Let's say that is down to loss aversion. Once we start to look at the behaviors that are essentially reducing your market returns, what we can start to do then is go, right, there's two things we can do about this. Is it possible to mitigate that bias? So is there something within the process that we can refine or add in, sometimes maybe even take out, that can help us to reduce exposure to the bias? So we could reduce maybe the frequency of it, maybe even the magnitude. And let's do that if we can. And at the back end, if we can't mitigate it in some way through some kind of process by enhancing your decision-making process, then we want to have some tools so we can recognize it and to manage it in real time. And so we kind of build a framework around that. Now, as a very general rule, it's probably fairly true to accept that most people are more prone to bias if stress levels are high, if they are fatigued, if they are working to very short time frames in their decision making, if ambiguity and uncertainty are high. So there are some forces that might amplify our proneness to bias, again, which we could put process in place to try to manage that. And I think the reading and research piece, kind of understanding the human condition, understanding the trading and investing condition and kind of what biases are out there that could play out, reflect back on your own trading. Again, this is where the trading data is so powerful, because the trading data can help you to identify the behaviors, and then we can maybe form some hunches as to what the bias might be behind that with a bit of investigation. So, but I would say loss aversion, overconfidence at the high end, recency, availability. Again, I think is a really common one that plays out. I think, endowment and sunk cost, again, play out for people in terms of their losses. So it's, and all others, Michael, really.
Yeah. And as you know, right, the other part of behavioral finance is the idea that just because you're aware of the bias doesn't mean you can do anything to change it.
Well, I saw Kahneman speak many years ago now. He was doing a speaking tour when he wrote, it must have been 4 or 5 years ago now. And he said, look, this is his life works. So he spent his entire, or the majority of his kind of professional life, investigating human behavior and bias and so on. And he still falls prone to them. Now, when I came away from that talk, I'm thinking, this is the person who's literally life work. He knows he's inside out. He's done the research. He's read the research. He knows all the people you need to know, understands it more than anybody can understand it. And yet he still falls prone to it. And I think that for me was a really key moment, because it just shows the knowledge is useful. And this is where I think, and Kahneman talks about how, it's easier to spot a bias in someone else than it is in ourselves. And that's how we can start to kind of maybe, be aware of the biases is by doing that exercise. But that's why I think if we just understand what the biases are that may play out, then if nothing else, we can start to think about, within the process, how we might just reduce our exposure to them. A bit like, if we understand as humans that there are many diseases and things that we potentially could catch, doesn't mean we are going to catch all of them. But if we adopt healthy lifestyle practices, at the front end, then we can reduce our exposure to and/or our ability to manage, if we do get them, any of what might come our way in terms of disease and illness going forward. And I think about biases in that same way. Let's understand what's out there and what the impact could be, what the illnesses and diseases can be. Let's develop some preventative practices up front. But let's make sure we've also got some things in place to be able to identify the disease and to manage it if we do happen to kind of catch it. So it's that sort of medical model for me, I think, probably fits quite nicely around sort of human behavior and biases as well.
maybe this is a naive question on my end, but I know you focus on this idea of high performance. Most people will think in terms of actual dollars and cents. To me, it's much more mental, right? High performance. But what is it that people seek out from performance coaches, kind of psychiatrists? Is it a degree of comfort, therapy? Are they looking for someone to vent to, or are they actively trying to change something about their personality that they find is problematic in terms of their own work? What is the underlying motivation for a lot of people that go to you?
All of those is the answer. So for some people, it's a chance. I mean, I had a client tell me a few years ago, we did one coaching session as a part of a program. And at the end of it, he said, this is the first time in my trading career, 10 years plus this is, where I genuinely feel that someone sat down, listened to what I've got to say, and I've been able to kind of have a very honest, open discussion about my performance with somebody who kind of gets it, but from outside the firm as such. So that's pretty interesting. So, like an external perspective, someone to vent, that's definitely part of the process. Sometimes allowing people just to, tell you their thoughts, their feelings about themselves, others, the markets can be very cathartic. People sometimes genuinely have identified in themselves that there's a behavior which is getting in the way of their, maximizing their market returns. They want some help with, essentially changing that behavior. Some people have got a particular goal they might want to try and achieve, get to the next level as they would see it in their trading and investing. Might involve some behavior change, improving some performance elements, might involve taking more risk, and they want help with that. Other people sometimes are just having a really tough time. They're in drawdown, they've just suffered a big loss, and they're just looking for someone to help them to kind of get out of where they're at and to get somewhere better. For some people, it's trying to reconcile the stresses and strains of the job with life. So, kind of finding that the right way to manage themselves as maybe a PM, but also as a partner and also as a parent and maybe as a friend and so on, and getting that piece right. Yeah, for some people, it's about they're already doing well and they want to be doing even better, or they want to sustain that going forward. How do I keep being successful over time? That's an interesting puzzle to try and solve as well. So yeah, a real wide range of reasons. And when I started in 2005, I had people who came to coaching, but were saying to me, don't tell anybody I've been to see you. It was like sports psychology was in the olden days, where people knew they needed it, but they didn't want anyone else to know they were having it. It was really seen as with a negative perception. Whereas now, thankfully, both in sport, military, in trading, investing, there's a much healthier and much more kind of performance enhancement focused mindset around coaching. So definitely seen for many people as a positive process, which is good.
Steve, what's the best way for people to find your work?
Yeah, probably two main ways: performanceedgeconsulting.co.uk, which is my website. Then if people are on LinkedIn, just look me up on LinkedIn.
I think that's a good place to wrap this Twitter space up. Folks that are on this, I have Dan Gardner up in about 8 minutes, who's co-authored a number of books, has worked with Phil Tetlock on Super Forecasters. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you, Steve. And again, this will be an edited podcast soon enough. Cheers, everybody.
Yeah, all the best. Cheers. Bye-bye.